My internet cord done come loose.
Wait, what?
We were sitting here mic checking and we do a little beep to sync this podcast before we start for people who don't know.
It's how Thrist made a thing that beeps with the internet time so that our beeps are in sync, which makes it easy, turns out, for us to sync up the conversation.
Yes, thanks to an enterprising member of our community. Anyway, I was tilting my head to hold the phone up to the microphone to beep as we always do.
You looked mystified.
The fiber is swaying in the breeze.
Oh no!
Have we talked about this before?
No. Is it hanging? Like, hold on. Your window looks out on the street, right?
Oh no, this window looks out on the fire escape.
Oh,
it looks out on the other unit on this floor in this building, which used to be my bedroom. I used to live in the other unit on this floor. I lived in a 1-bedroom on this floor.
Really?
Yes. And then at some point, the couple in this 2-bedroom that we're in vacated.
And you just moved down the hall?
And I had the easiest moving experience of my life and moved everything about 15 feet down the hall.
That's incredible. I had no idea.
Yes, but now this office that I do all my work in here looks out on my former bedroom window. Anyway, it's a little like cutout fire escape. There's a full-on ladder and everything. The fiber runs into this room.
And it's just loose? It's not like tacked up to the wall or anything?
It's always been loose. So when Sonic installed the fiber here in 2016, I was here.
Yeah.
The guy was just like, hey, what room do you want the fiber to run into? I was like, oh, the office where I work when my computer is would be good. He kind of just threw it over the top of the building.
Okay.
And it just runs from the roof down the side of 2 floors from the roof.
Yeah.
Unattached to anything.
How does that make you feel?
Until it terminates in the place where he ran it through. He drilled a hole in the wall and ran it through.
Wow.
Anyway.
How are you feeling about that? Does that make you feel good or not so much?
A couple times I've gone out there. I have these little stick-on plastic things I got from Monoprice that are meant to run a zip tie through. Mm-hmm. It's just an adhesive backing with
it's like a square with a little notch through the top. Yeah.
I've zip tied it to the side of the building with those a couple times, but every time it rains a lot, as it has again recently, those things come right off.
Oh boy. You know what you need?
What's that?
Nanotape.
Well, so it's a weird shingled, it's like a dappled or ridged kind of shingle siding on the building. So I don't think nanotape would stick very well, but all your common household adhesive things are also not going to stand up to the elements.
You need one of those 3M goos, like one of the ones that's like a permanent, it's like a gray kind of squishy thing that as soon as it gets exposed to the air, it starts to harden up and you just jam it on there. And it's going to glue on forever. Do
you think I need to ask the landlord before I do that?
He's going to tell you no.
Yeah. So I shouldn't ask.
This is a forgiveness situation, not a permission, I think.
I think you're right. Or, maybe that cable is very resilient. It's very thin. It's a very thin, skinny, seemingly brittle cable. I mean, it's fiber. Of course it's brittle. I don't like my internet flying around in the wind. I
mean, the scary thing about this seems like if there's roofers or something that come in to work on something else unrelated to the fiber, they could very easily be the modern equivalent of a backhoe on the May East pipeline shutting down internet for 2/3 of the country.
Yeah. This is a precarious situation. Actually, thinking back to the install the day he got here, I had to wait a month or something. It was fiber was new in the city at that time.
Yeah, it was. You were the first person I knew with fiber, I think.
You remember when I got fiber and how excited I was?
It was a look. I was like, hey, can I come over to your house and try it? And you were like, no, you can't come over. I'm sorry.
That did not happen, for the record.
Yeah, no, I didn't ask. You didn't deny.
That conversation never took place. The day he installed it, I had to wait a month. And I was actually about to go out of the country then for 2 days later.
Is this a giant bomb already, or was this before that?
Yeah, this is 2016.
Okay.
So not only was I about to leave the country for a week, so the detail I left out, they were repaving the street that day. And they were literally at the end of the block, we're about to start working their way up. And he was like, hey, by the way, I just talked to these road guys. They say I have to be out of here in 90 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And if I don't get this done before they tell me I have to leave, you have to go to the back of the queue for installs.
What? He couldn't just park on another block?
Which is several months long at this point. I think I think his truck had one of those the extending arm.
Oh, he had a bucket or something.
Yeah, because he had to go up to the pole.
Got it. He wasn't just using ladders.
Yes, wow. He needed his truck to do the install. And essentially he was like, hey, if I don't get this installed in the next hour or so, you're going to have to wait another 3 or 4 months for this. So it's please do what you can to get this done.
Yeah, go as fast as you can, man. So I'll stay out of your way.
And tipped him heavily. But I think that may be why the line is unsecured on top of the building.
I feel like having a real time pressure on that is going to add some tension and stress that is not necessary.
But it was very exciting when he came in and he was just like, all right, you're good to go. But now I have this situation.
You could just tack it on there. Wait until the landlord's out.
Stick a thumbtack through it.
Get some. No, don't stick it.
I'm joking.
You get the little loops. You get the half loops with the nail on the side. Just bop, bop, bop. 3 of them in. You're good to go. That's how they did my fiber to the wall.
I don't know what the siding is made out of, but sticking nails in it seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, it's probably fine. Like what's the worst that could happen? Some Looney Tunes nonsense where like the coyote gets the fiber hooked up to him as he runs away and like pulls everybody on the streets fiber out of their houses.
Oh my God. I'll be right back.
Welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
It is a rainy Saturday here in the Bay Area.
It is. Man, it's been pouring.
I think I'm done. I think I like having spent some time in the desert in the summer and seen what real storms are like there. I don't really like that, but I do like being warm. It turns out warm is nice. I don't think I'm tired of living someplace where it's this kind of miserable and wet all the time.
Well, not all the time. Let's be specific here.
Only 8 months a year.
We're in the rainy season right now. You know what? Frankly, I'm happy the rainy season is back because we didn't have it for some years.
Look, this is a hot take. I don't know that I'm as big a fan of the rainy season as you are, Brad.
Well, I don't know if I'd say I'm a fan of it, but it's a necessary evil.
Look, I like the state not burning and I like having water. Not so much a fan of the 90 days of rain or whatever it is we're in right now.
I mean, you know what I like, though, is all the parks around here are absolutely gorgeous after this much rain because they're usually brown and dead and desiccated.
Have you gone walking in one, though? Because they're like my backyard and front yard. They're like 2 inches deep of mud right now. So,
well, I mean, once it dries, give it a few days. But like I walked by Golden Gate Park the other day and it is an explosion of green right now.
I had to wheel my trash cans back in last night after another inch of rain. And I was like, I think I have to lift up the cans so they don't dig ruts in my yard. And like, anyway,
this might be one of those cases where not being a homeowner makes this a little more palatable.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of stress that comes with like, it's just to be clear, we're not talking about like baby rain sprinkles or anything like that. We're getting like 1 or 2 inches of rain per storm, which sometimes is like a day. Sometimes it's like 3, sometimes it's up to 4 inches. I think this next one is supposed to be worse than the last one.
Yeah, so it's like, it's going to rain like all week. I think I just saw, isn't it here? Yeah.
And most of the dirt here does not absorb water at that kind of water. Like we have like my house is on basically clay. So it absorbs for a little bit and then it just gets saturated and everything turns into a swamp. So it's a lot.
Yeah. It is.
But at least theoretically, maybe the state won't burn again this fall. So that's good.
Yes.
Let's
hang on. I got a segue. You know what else is a lot?
The PC game settings.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so we had a Discord user, OS X or OS 10, you think?
It's capital O, lowercase SX.
Is that OSX?
So yeah, you could actually be meant to pronounce that phonetically. I miss the days when we got to say OS 10. I hate this transition back to Mac OS.
You just bring that energy over to 10, the successor to Twitter.
God damn it.
OS X said, I would love an episode about tuning PC games advanced graphics settings. Some sample topics that come to mind are DLSS 2 and 3, FSR 1, 2, and 3, XESS. What does the sharpness slider do under these options? Do I need to manually lower the in-game resolution for them to upscale correctly? What is SSAO? How do various variable refresh rate technologies interact with VSync? And do I need to turn it off, VSync, I assume, in each game? How can I verify it's working? What if I have multiple monitors? This is a good question, it turns out.
Well, OS X, I'm glad you asked.
We have been digging in and we've done a lot of reading, I'm going to say, and watching videos and a lot of stuff. Turns out PC game settings kind of complicated most of the time. Yeah, but knowable, I would say. They're not so arcane that we can't unpack them with a little research. Yeah, and I mean, the thing to remember, and like we like to peel the onion here and start with the easy part first and go to the complicated stuff later, is that if you don't really care all that much, you can just load up the GeForce Experience or Radeon settings app on your computer and hit the button that says make this pretty good. Like hit the optimize button.
Yeah.
And it'll give you like, it'll usually what they do is they use the profiling data that they have from testing games to look at what the hardware is in your system, and they find a comp, the closest comp in their database. And then they put you settings that'll run you at 60 frames a second. Is the general guideline. So I do that for almost everything, except for competitive shooters and stuff with lots of ray tracing settings.
See, this is the difference between you and me.
Look, I have a kid and like 2.5 jobs. I don't have time to dink around. If I want to ever play games, I have to just get into it.
I get it. Yes. I mean, I also have like 2.5 jobs. I don't have a kid, though, to be fair, but I don't install GeForce Experience.
Why not, Brad?
I just don't feel like I need it. Well, actually, to be more specific, there are too many other overlays already, and I know you can disable parts of it.
I just turn off the overlay,
Yeah, like I know you can turn parts of that off, but like there's already the Steam overlay, there's already Game Bar.
I wish you could turn off Game Bar.
Game Bar is way better than it used to be. Have you used it lately?
Yeah, the little I've used when we were doing profiling stuff on the Anacrusis, I used it because that overlay with the frame rate data was pretty useful.
Yeah.
The thing I like about GeForce Experience, and sometimes if I'm troubleshooting perf stuff, I will turn on the overlay because they have the 1% frame rate. They report the frames per second of the slowest 1% of frames
in real time. They track
real time
the 1% lows. That's pretty useful.
Which is maybe the most useful like real time feature ever. It lets you know when you're having bad stutter. Anyway,
sure.
The point is, if you don't care about this stuff, you can just skip this entire episode basically and mash the optimize button in Radeon settings or GeForce Experience.
Yeah, and
get something that's pretty good.
Intel has been leaning in this direction more too lately. I'm not sure what they've got for their ARC cards for their GPU stuff, but they rolled out a tool for their CPUs. What is it? The name is escaping me. It's more for tuning CPU stuff, I want to say.
I don't want to have to tune CPU stuff too, Brad. I just want to like start the game and play the game and not think about this stuff. That's my dream.
Application Optimizer, I believe, is the name of it. I was trying to figure out what the P stood for, but it's one of those things where the A and the P came from the same word. Anyway, this is getting a little tangential to the actual topic of this episode, but like CPU tweaking has gotten really interesting. I don't know if you've paid much attention to what Intel and AMD are both doing, where they both have ways of identifying like which cores are the good cores on your specific chip.
Yeah.
You know, because just straight up variance in manufacturing, like silicon lottery style, everybody's cores are going to be of different quality. So it'll like actually tell you like, okay, these are the cores on your CPU that actually run the fastest, and it will bias toward those type stuff.
Maybe I need to run that on my computer because I have to clock down to 52x on my 13900K to get Fortnite to not crash on launch, basically because of the memory corruption stuff. Anyway,
so I'll say real quick before we move back to graphics. At launch, APO was just for 14th gen.
Okay.
But this headline I have just pulled from 2 weeks ago makes it sound like they are going to
roll it back
at least to some extent to 12th and 13th gen.
That seems fair since it's the same socket. Anyway.
Yes.
So yeah, but from here on, we're going to go down, like we're going to answer these questions from OSX or OSX.
Yeah.
We also went through and pulled some screenshots from like current games, Cyberpunk, Alan Wake, Fortnite.
Yeah.
The Prince of Persia ones were comically thin. I think there's a couple others in there, and we'll kind of go down the settings and explain what is the perf, like what stuff is going to really hit your perf, what stuff doesn't matter as much, and explain what some of the stuff means.
Yes. Yeah. I threw Baldur's Gate 3 in there.
Oh, nice. I didn't see that.
And the finals and stuff. There's a bunch in there, but we will. People seem to like it. A couple weeks ago when we published the Google Doc that we used for notes for the show.
Yeah.
So I will do that again. We have all those images embedded in there. I hate the way the Google Docs handles image embeds, which is to say that it's kind of hard. It's not easy to get the full size version of the images out.
Okay, hold down Control and then mouse wheel forward, and then take a screenshot of the document. That's how you get. That's how you get it out of there.
Yes. Well, so actually, have you ever used this Google Docs like publish to web feature? It's really nice. That's what I used when we did this a couple weeks ago.
And it just makes an HTML, like a HTML with an image folder or something?
Yes. When you go to share now, there's an option instead of like sharing a link to the doc, you can hit publish to web and it'll just, like you said.
Where'd you put it?
It generates a link. Although you can, I should probably make a short URL. What's your favorite URL shortener these days?
Content.town.
Oh.
I haven't actually done it yet, but I've been looking at things I can put on there that will generate short URLs.
That would be cool. We should do that.
Yeah, that would be a good one.
Anyway, so I mean, you can scale that HTML based version that we will link in the show notes as well to see the screenshots. It's a little hard to read a lot of the settings at the default image size, but
yeah. Or you can zoom in also if you don't care.
Well, that's what I mean. The control mouse wheel up and down tip applies there as well.
So let's get into it. The first thing, the big one these days, this is a hot button topic that everybody cares about because the graphics vendors are in a full ass war over super sampling these days.
Yeah.
Super sampling is the idea that you take, it used to be the idea that you take the resolution that you're running and then you render it up at so say you want to run at 1080p, you used to run it at 4K, and then you'd take every 4 pixels on the 4K version would get combined, like mathematically averaged, and you'd get a 1080p image that has like smoother edges and all the kind of benefits of super sampling. That's not what it does anymore, it turns out.
Yeah, you would do that in games where you had a lot of headroom to spare, like Destiny 2, for example. You could do that on like a 1080 even in a game it's not old, but it's a bit older.
Well,
and lightweight enough that and that obviously that results in a much cleaner image. But also, now that you mention it, that is what super sampling used to mean. I don't know that technically what we're doing now, which is the reverse direction, still counts as super sampling, but whatever.
So the reason they call it super sampling is because what they're doing is they're generating the 4 pixels with machine learning now, and fair. And then dividing and then combining them without doing the upsize render. Anyway. The thing that they use this stuff for, DLSS, this is DLSS and FSR and XESS on NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel respectively.
Yes.
And the thing that they do is they're using these to upscale in a way that that adds more information than you would get with just straight upscaling. So you can basically render the game at a lower resolution, upscale it using these technologies, and then get the benefit of the higher resolution, most of the benefit of the higher resolution at the frame rate of the lower resolution.
Yes. And this is, excuse me, this is the prototypical example of the good use of AI or machine learning that I've talked about recently, where this is a signal processing kind of AI where you're taking an input and doing something to it that you couldn't do as well without the AI. Like this is the good type of AI usage, not the generative.
Well, it's generative, but it's not bad generative.
Yeah, well, yes.
It's not infringy generative.
Yes, you're right. It is technically under the hood. It is generating new imagery, but it's trained off of the data set. It's trained off of is just footage of games or data from games that are running. It's kind of a different thing.
So the upshot is that there's three vendor supported options.
Mm-hmm.
DLSS is NVIDIA's, XESS is Intel's, and FSR is AMD's. Generally speaking, you're better off using the one that goes with your card if that's an option. So if you have an NVIDIA card, use DLSS. If you have an AMD card, use FSR. If you have an Intel card, use XESS. The reason for that is that on the ones that are ML accelerated, that use that are DLSS and XESS use the dedicated machine learning acceleration hardware on those cards. So that means they don't take resources away from the graphics rendering as much as say like running a compute shader would, right? It doesn't seem like that impacts FSR as much because it just uses compute shaders on all hardware.
Yeah,
which AMD tends to like platform agnostic features, which I appreciate, but there's a negative. The negative is that you're taking resources away from the game if the game is trying to use the same compute shaders.
That's why they've been out there kind of ballyhooing like, hey, FSR works on all hardware. It's because it runs in a generic enough way that pretty much what you just said. It sounds like FSR 3, which is not that old, might have some very light hooks into machine learning. Well, from what I've looked around at, but I think the bigger point is that like AMD's machine learning hardware efforts are just kind of behind.
They have not done a bunch of platform or vendor specific stuff. It seems like. Yeah.
I think their acquisition of Xilinx several years ago is what was intended to address their being behind in the AI race. So, and in fact, I think they've made a bunch of announcements about like the next Ryzens and the next everything they're doing is going to have a bunch of a bunch of AI hardware in it, but they're not quite there yet. Intel seems like they're pretty well on the path, though.
Yeah. So anyway, the upshot is use the one that you have. If you don't have one, I think FSR 2 and 3 are 2 is a subset of 3. So 2 does the basically 4xing of resolutions in the same way that DLSS does. FSR 1, it has terrible image quality problems, and I don't think anybody should use it in any circumstances. They did some weird stuff that just didn't work particularly well. 2 is much better. It's they, as with almost all of these things, when you look at like the Digital Foundry like comparison in games that support both, they both fail in different ways. both fail in interesting ways that you're probably not going to notice in an actual game. So, for example, DLSS is better at pulling overlay stuff like text rendered on the game world, fire, like the kind of 2D textures that make up most Fire VFX, stuff like that. It does a little bit better with that. FSR does better with some other stuff. So like, you know, generally speaking, use the one that your hardware supports. NVIDIA, it's worth mentioning, DLSS only works on NVIDIA hardware.
Yeah.
So,
and it's gotten very good also, we should say, as of like DLSS 3.5, it is extremely capable.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I can't speak as much to the AMD stuff because we didn't support FSR on Anacrusis, but with DLSS, they look at what you implement and they're like, hey, we noticed some ghosting here or something like that. And they'll say, you know, if your hair is ghosting, if your hair is rendered in this way, you might want to use this version of the model instead of this version of the model. And they'll even bake stuff out special for you if you need a little bit of extra help.
Yeah, I've gotten to the point. I think we talked about this before we recorded. Like, I pretty much always turn it on, even if it's a game that I am quite sure I could run at native res just fine.
Yeah, so I have a 360 hertz display, so I always have it turned on.
Yeah, you definitely have to.
But also, I often don't run games at the full frame rate because it's nice to have it running slower so it doesn't spin up all the fans in the computer.
Sure.
Anyway, so the two things that happened recently are with DLSS 3.5 and FSR 3, there's frame generation. So FSR 3 is a superset of 2. It's basically 2 plus frame generation. DLSS 3.5 is 3 with frame generation. I think the DLSS 3 stuff only works, 3 and newer only works on the Ada 4000 series cards.
I think that's right. Yes, I believe frame generation only runs on. So I think frame generation was part of 3.0. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was, but the 3.5 stuff adds the path tracing and all that stuff for ray tracing.
Ray reconstruction. And all that stuff.
Reconstruction. Okay, so this is where it gets complicated, because if you have a 2 series card or a 3 series card from NVIDIA, you might want the frame generation that comes with FSR 3, which is not supported on your card on the DLSS side. The weird thing about frame generation is you want to have on both sides a 60 frame per second render after the upscaling. So after the DLSS 2 and FSR 2 stuff happens, before you start doing the frame generation, because otherwise you get some weird artifacting that is pretty noticeable in my experience. So this isn't going to, it can effectively double your frame rate in some cases, but you have to already be running at 60 frames per second in order for that to work. So this is basically for getting high refresh rates on high res monitors on lower spec cards.
Yeah. Do you use frame generation as a matter of course very much?
So I was gonna say the problem with frame generation is that it increases input latency.
Yeah, that's my question, because I've only used it enough to like try it, just 5 minutes at a time in different games. Like I haven't used it to actually like seriously play a game, and so I wonder what the perceptual effect is over time if you get used to it or not, and also how bad the latency actually is.
So Digital Foundry did a thing about this earlier last year, I guess, like mid last year when the stuff was new, and the way that both AMD and NVIDIA try to counter the latency, the basically input to pixel lag is what we're talking about. The time between you make your input choice and the change registers on screen. So for example, pulling a trigger and the gun shooting. NVIDIA uses reflex. AMD uses a thing called anti-lag that are basically the same thing that basically they queue frames so that you don't render too many frames in advance, which helps minimize that lag. Now, with those technologies on, with reflex on and with anti-lag on, it's pretty minimal. It's like 17 milliseconds. So it's almost negligible, pretty much impossible to detect for most people. I wouldn't use frame generation in anything that's competitive. I probably also wouldn't use frame generation if I'm playing on mouse and keyboard, in my experience. So like when I was playing Cyberpunk on mouse and keyboard, didn't feel great. When I was playing Cyberpunk on the gamepad, didn't notice a difference. So, the kind of fiddliness of the direct, my expectation with a mouse is that there's, pixel to pixel precision on a mouse movement. And on the gamepad, I'm used to it feeling a little floatier, which didn't really impact my experience much. So that's the deal. That's the super sampling. Like, that's it. Super sampling is going to make your performance better. It's a weird choice for a name because super sampling used to make your games run slow as hell. So I generally, if I'm playing at 1080p and I'm playing a multiplayer game, I set it to the performance mode. We should explain what this means.
So I assume that's a question from OSX here. I assume by slider they're referring to and I think some games do depict it as a slider. The deal, like for example, the DLSS presets, the kind of named presets like quality, balance, performance, ultra performance. What does those mean? And
those presets are actually defined by NVIDIA. They ask you to, when you set up your settings in your game, they ask you to make sure that they align with what players' expectations are, so that they're the same across the board.
Yeah, so those basically have specific meanings for what size of image is being rendered under the hood before it is then upsampled to your output resolution. Yeah. For example, 4K.
Yeah. So on ultra performance, you're upscaling from assuming you're running at 4K. Ultra performance, you're upscaling from 720p to 4K, which means you're rendering 11% of the pixels on the screen for real, and then making the other 89% with DLSS.
Yeah, and in my experience, if you tried ultra performance, you can see that.
Yeah, ultra performance usually feels pretty muddy,
as you can imagine, with barely over a tenth of the actual pixel data to work from. Like there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, a performance mode is upscaling from 1080p to 4K, which means you're rendering 25% of the pixels and generating the other 75%. Balanced is from 1253p, which I didn't actually put in the spreadsheet, so I don't know what the percentage is.
33%, I believe.
That seems right. Split the difference. And then quality is 44% of pixels. It's rendering from 1440p up to 4K.
Yes. Or maybe an easier way to think about that is, again, this is all assuming you're outputting at 4K. This is all trickles down from what output resolution you're talking about. But at 4K, for example, quality means you're doing a 1440p under the hood.
Yeah.
Or performance, I believe. Yeah, performance is the one that would be 1080p.
And I don't have the settings for 1080p or 1440p in front of you, but I believe that the resolutions, I don't believe it's the same percentages across the board.
Oh, I thought the percentages were fixed. I think that's right. Yeah, because like the whole Alan Wake 2 controversy, the thing you saw people screaming about was that they said at 1080p performance, DLSS performance, you would get blah 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 30 frames or whatever it was. Right. That's where you saw a bajillion people running around screaming like, oh, so you can only render at 540p? What the hell? So
that would make sense.
Yeah. So I think the percentages
are the same,
are fixed on these presets, and that's all just DLSS. Obviously, Intel and AMD are going to have different things going on.
Yeah. The thing I'll say is, as a 1080p player, ultra performance always looks real bad, and I assume it's because you're starting with like 1990s resolutions and going up from there.
Yeah.
Quality at 1080p is great. I run quality a lot. Anyway, let's see. One of the other questions from OSX was, do I need to manually lower the in-game resolution for them to upscale? No, you set the resolution that you want. Generally, you should set the resolution for what your monitor is hard, like the resolution of your monitor.
Yeah, native.
And as you said a minute ago, Brad, a lot of games will actually show you what the internal rendering res is. I think XeSS lets you set the internal rendering resolution rather than a quality profiler percentage.
Oh, interesting.
That might be something that is a per game setting, though, because I've seen it both ways, I think, on XeSS.
Okay. So even for DLSS, I'll just mention Alan Wake 2 is an outlier here where they don't use the names of those presets.
Whoa.
They let you pick the internal render resolution.
Okay.
But without the game running in front of me, I can't say for sure. But I think all you're doing is picking those resolutions that would correspond to those presets to begin with. So that is a case where, the answer in this one specific case, the answer is yes, you do have to pick the render resolution in Alan Wake 2. But again, I think it's just it's just mapping to those presets without them using the names of the presets. Anyway, long story short. Also, sorry, I forgot to mention, a lot of, at least with DLSS, a lot of the preset selection now just lets you just set it to auto, which I assume is just targeting some performance target, and it maybe is adjusting it on the fly to try to maintain frame rate.
That would make sense, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is screen space is SSAO. What is SSAO? It stands for screen space ambient occlusion.
Yes.
And it's a post-process effect. So it happens after the scene's been rendered, and it adds things like reflections and shadows, fuzzy shadows around the edges of things.
Yeah. So ambient occlusion basically is just a bunch of fine shadowing in nooks and crannies, anywhere that like the ambient light would be occluded by objects, So if you got like a bench or whatever, there should be little bits of shadow right behind where the seat and the railing and stuff would be occluding the light. Screen space effects, like you mentioned, like ambient occlusion and reflections, rely on data that is being generated as a part of rendering what's already in frame.
Yeah.
So if you ever played a game where you like sweep the camera around and you've got something like a big pond or like glass that's reflecting stuff, and as the thing that's being reflected moves out of frame, you see those reflections vanishing at the same time. That's a screen space effect. That is essentially like the engine no longer has the data it needs to render those reflections because it's not rendering the source objects in the first place. It's all just like a shortcut. Like the screen space effects are just a shortcut to use data that already exists per frame to create additional effects because otherwise it would be like way too computationally expensive to calculate those from scratch.
So sometimes you over-render the actual screen space. So the actual thing that's being rendered is larger than it's actually being shown. Sure. So that you avoid that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think you see it more on consoles where they don't have as much performance headroom to work with.
Yeah. And the neat thing about ambient occlusion is it's way cheaper than doing it for real. Like this is a lot of most of what we're talking about today applies to raster games. So games that use a traditional, like, hey, we're going to draw a bunch of textures mapped over wireframes, and then we're going to put some other textures that are serving as light maps that indicate the light and the dark areas. Then we're going to put some other textures that indicate like whether the surface is bumpy or smooth and all this stuff. We're going to talk about ray tracing a little bit, and it changes. Like right now we're using mostly kind of combined raster and ray tracing games. It's still, the ray tracing is changing basically everything that we're talking about here, because like SSAO doesn't apply for ray tracing. Ambient occlusion and reflections are two places where you don't need the screen space versions of those effects anymore, because ray tracing just does those inherently. Yeah, and it's also, we're saying SSAO is memory intense and expensive. So like if you're having perf problems, it's not a terrible thing to turn down. Yeah. Also, I actually let me add on to what I just said. That's in like a full path tracing kind of scenario. You get all that stuff. Like there are a lot of games that use ray tracing in more limited ways that would not cover those use cases. Yeah. Okay, so the next thing is variable refresh rate. This is confusing. This was confusing even for us as we were researching this episode. Yeah, I learned stuff today. Yes, when I built this machine last year, I had figured this out years ago and then promptly forgot it, as you often do when you figure out obscure settings and set them once, right? That's good for your brain to just let that stuff fall away. Yeah, it'll change before the next time you need it, probably. But the one thing I can say is definitely don't ever document anything you do. No. Documentation's for chumps, is my understanding. What would that accomplish? But anyway, so this is relatively fresh in mind because I had to figure this stuff out again last year. This is only relevant for NVIDIA because it's what I've been using for years. I can't speak to AMD and Intel here, but the question is, so it's how do variable refresh rate technologies interact with VSync? The first question, do I need to turn it off in each game? I was going to say, just generally speaking, Blurbusters is a great resource for this because they do a ton of like hands-on research and aim high-speed cameras at monitors and do all sorts of crazy stuff with all the available hardware. So if you have questions about setup that we aren't going to talk about here today, Blurbusters is the number one resource, I think. Yeah.
So the combo settings I have found on NVIDIA that will consistently get variable refresh to work is in the NVIDIA control panel. You want to turn on G-Sync. So there's a setting under 3D settings called monitor technology, which will say G-Sync or G-Sync compatible. If you don't have an actual G-Sync monitor, if it's like a FreeSync monitor, it'll say compatible.
Yeah.
At any rate, you want to turn on the adaptive refresh technology under monitor technology. And then you want to force VSync to on in the driver control panel. And then thereafter, you always want to turn VSync off in every game that you're playing.
Yeah.
Because then you're having the driver use its global, it's overriding the game's behavior with the global driver VSync. And that's the only way I've found to very consistently get variable refresh to work in everything.
This is one of the benefits of using GeForce Experience for this stuff, is it just does this and you don't have to worry about it in games.
Okay. Well, I only had to worry about it until I figured it out.
Oh, yeah. No, but I mean, you don't have to go into each game setting and change this, right?
To turn off VSync. Sure.
Yeah, to turn off VSync. The Blurbusters explanation of this is that the G-Sync's ability to fall back on a fixed refresh rate VSync behavior changed in 2015 when they exposed the option to do this. Right now, because you see both, people think that G-Sync and VSync are separate options, but when G-Sync is enabled in the control panel, the vertical sync option in the control panel no longer acts as VSync and actually dictates whether the G-Sync module compensates for frame rate variances by the system, which prevents tearing. And that's if G-Sync and VSync are, if G-Sync is on and VSync is off. This is really confusing.
This is a lot. I think what you're saying, I mean, this is just arbitrary NVIDIA driver behavior, right? Like that you need VSync on, but then once you enable G-Sync, then it's going to use G-Sync as VSync is what you're saying.
But yeah, with VSync on, in order, it has to also to do with the fallback for when you get outside the range where VSync matters.
Right. Yes.
So once your G-Sync is, what G-Sync is really for is when you're running at less than the refresh rate of the monitor, right? And so basically the upshot is if you turn G-Sync on and you turn VSync on, the driver just handles it and you don't have to worry about all the other nonsense.
Yes.
The other part of this is that if your game has a frame limit and your game consistently runs above the refresh rate of your monitor, you want to set the frame limit to just below the actual frame rate of the refresh rate of the monitor.
Yes.
To reduce tearing, to make sure tearing never happens. Yes. And it's like 3 to 5 frames a second usually.
Yeah. For example, I have a 144 hertz monitor and I set a 140 FPS cap in my drivers.
Yeah. Well, you can also do that in the game as well if that's an option. The other thing is that NVIDIA added a new fast VSync option between the time the Blurbusters article about G-Sync and VSync was written and now. And you only want to use that if your frame rate is 2x your refresh rate or more, and you're probably not using G-Sync monitors. So generally speaking, if you have a G-Sync monitor, you do not turn on fast VSync. If you don't have a VSync monitor, a G-Sync monitor, and you're running, so if you have a 60 hertz non-variable refresh rate monitor and your games are running at more than 2x your refresh rate of your monitor, turning on the fast one will give you benefits. I can't imagine that there's a lot of people in that situation that don't have G-Sync monitors or FreeSync monitors at this point.
That's almost certainly the case.
Brad, how can you tell if this is working?
Yeah, next question. How can I verify it's working? Your monitor's on-screen display should show you in real time the sync rate fluctuating up and down. I can't imagine there is a monitor that has adaptive refresh that doesn't show it there, right?
Mine does.
Yeah, my Asus monitors do. My TV does. Like I think just about everything that does some form of variable refresh will just show you in the display settings what it is at any given moment.
I even have a little thing that I can put the number in the top right corner if I really want to feel inadequate or excited about my frame rate, depending on how things are going.
Ooh, I might have to look for that.
Well, one of the other questions is, what if you have multiple monitors? So from a frame rate perspective, Windows 11 and I think 10 both treat can run multiple monitors at independent resolutions and refresh rates with no problem. So like my main monitor is running at 360 hertz. My top monitor is running at 60 hertz. My right monitor is running at 60 hertz. No problem. If you're say using a 2 PC streaming setup, you can even mirror, as long as you mirror them in the right order and have the refresh rate set before you do the mirroring, you can set your main monitor to run at the video game resolution, like the 144 or 360 hertz, whatever. And the capture card will still run at 60. It'll just take every X frames to send to the capture card. So that stuff works great. The Weird thing is that multiple monitors in the past has really impacted performance. In the pre-Windows 8 days, like Windows 7, like the last generation of desktop window manager and the early stuff that started with Vista and got better gradually over time, there was a major performance hit when you're running full screen games and you had stuff running on other monitors. It's less of an issue with Windows 10 and 11. Linus Tech Tips did a video where they tested up to, I think, 4 monitors with videos running full screen on the other monitors while you played a game, which showed that there was some impact. But I think realistically, nobody's going to be watching 4 videos at once. You're much more likely to just have like one video and then some text, like a guide or something like that, like just static text basically, and maybe images. If you are concerned about it and if you're in perf issues, you can use Win+P to turn off your secondary monitors when you're playing games really easily.
Yeah. Or just hit the power switch.
Also, we should talk about game mode. On Windows 11, there is a game mode setting that it is on by default. Most people don't ever have to change it. It's worth checking. You can open the settings panel and just type game mode and it'll pop up. And basically what it does is it like does some pain in the ass stuff, like turns off notifications while you're playing games. But the big one is that it lets the window manager know that you play games on this computer. So it handles full screen games a little bit differently sometimes. Sure.
Another thing to know about here is full screen versus borderless window or windowed if you really want to play in a window, but who does
Only
that?
Weirdos play in Windows.
Unless it's like Vampire Survivors or something, maybe. But
I'm judging them too.
As the name implies, borderless windowed means you're technically actually still playing in a window. It just is showing, it's displaying the contents of the window at full screen without, scroll bars or title bars or anything like that. So it looks like it's full screen. But you're still getting the benefit of it being a windowed application, meaning you can all tab in and out very cleanly.
Like you can, if you're in in a lot of games, if you have a UI menu up that gives you a mouse cursor, you can just move it out of the window like a normal ass application.
Yeah.
The problem is that this is a place where there used to be a performance hit for doing the borderless windowed thing.
Yeah.
Because in the exclusive full screen, Windows in the old days, Windows would just say, hey, this is all you, buddy. You got everything. You got the GPU, got the CPU, we're turning off the window manager. We're just going to let you do your stuff. And then if you wanted to say Alt Tab, it would minimize the game. The game would go away. But it works differently now is the thing.
And back in the day, this is less of a thing now that people game at their native monitor resolution more. But if you were running in a different video mode, it would require like a whole monitor video mode switch when you tabbed in and out of the game, which was slow and clunky.
It still does sometimes if you have a weird refresh rate monitor. Like a lot of games don't know what to do with my monitor.
Sure.
And so then like if your game's max refresh rate setting is 144 hertz, it'll just bump you down to 144 hertz on that monitor if you go in the exclusive full screen mode.
Yeah. So yeah, like we said, borderless window avoids all those annoying issues, but yes, there is or was a performance delta at some point.
So from a survey, I went through and searched Reddit for people complaining about borderless window and exclusive full screen performance problems. And it seems like PUBG over the years has been a game you should probably play in exclusive full screen. GTA 5 is a game that has a significant performance boost running in borderless.
Huh.
It seemed all over the place on what's faster and what's slower in full screen or borderless. And of course, it's important to note like the convenience of not having to like mode shift the monitor when you switch in and out of the game is substantial. So
yes.
I would just test on game by game basis for the games that you're playing.
Yeah. I will throw in. I've had a lot better luck getting variable refresh to work reliably in full screen modes than with borderless. Like the NVIDIA control panel does let you turn on variable refresh for windowed applications, but it seems a lot less reliable in my experience.
Are you, so it's funny. I've had the opposite experience because usually it works pretty well. My desktop is always working in the variable refresh mode, and it just, if the game works, then the desktop works when you're in borderless. If the desktop works, then the game works when you're in borderless. In my experience.
Interesting.
Yeah.
One other tidbit I threw in here, and I got this from the Discord a year or two ago.
This was fascinating, I thought.
Yeah. So this happened, I believe, sometime after Windows 10 came out. Microsoft rolled out a feature, and this is a very under the hood thing. They call it full screen optimizations, which actually means, and I think there is a way to disable this, but it's on by default. It means that if you tell a game to run in full screen, it thinks it's running in full screen. but Windows actually is kind of intercepting it, and there's some kind of best of both worlds, like abstraction layer happening, where it's like the game is doing what it would be doing in full screen, but they are still like Windows has still got some kind of compatibility layer where it's also making it easier to all tab in and out and stuff like that. Like you could read this blog post I linked if you want to know more about the technical details, but the idea there is to try to kind of capture the best benefits of both modes.
Yeah, the desktop window manager is the thing that handles rendering everything on the desktop generally, except for exclusive full screen apps. So the fact that they pulled this in, you can disable this in the launch options in the compatibility tab for pretty much every executable on your computer. I think it is literally called disable full screen optimizations.
Okay, there we go. I've had really good luck with it though. I run most all games in quote unquote full screen, but with this under the hood, of course, and it's all worked pretty well for me.
So do they still minimize when you alt tab out?
Some of them do. Actually, that behavior is kind of unpredictable. Like a decent number of games still do minimize, but some of them do not.
Because I'm often streaming and I don't necessarily want to show my desktop to everybody when I alt tab, I do tend to use borderless windowed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you're doing a video output into a stream machine, right?
Yeah, I'm not doing I don't use OBS to capture a window and then broadcast it out someplace else anymore. I used to do that, but it was just removing layers of hassle. It turns out is important for me.
Yeah.
The next big place where there's stuff that's confusing is post-processing. And usually people group these together in their display options often. So here's an interesting question for you, Brad. When you're looking at display options or graphics options in a game, typically people put them in the same order. It's always like resolution at the top. And it seems like the preferred way, or maybe the scheme that people use, is to put the stuff that's the highest impact toward the top and the lowest impact toward the bottom in terms of performance.
Yeah, I think that is intuitive.
Except for now that we have ray tracing stuff and that's always at the bottom, it's like we've completely upended the entire hierarchy. So, but post-processing stuff is all the stuff that happens after the scene's rendered. So, you've drawn your polygons, you've applied textures to them, you've applied your light maps, you've done all the highlights and the reflectivity and all that stuff, and then you have this time to work inside the rendered scene. And stuff like reflections and ambient occlusion, which we've talked about a little bit. Depth of field usually comes in at this point, so you blur the stuff that's far away or too close, that's outside of the focal range of the camera. Bloom, where you brighten up areas that have light sources. And
anybody who played video games from, let's say, like 2002 to 6 or 7.
Remember, it was more than that, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it definitely kept going from there, but there was a period like mid original Xbox with like Fable and some stuff like that. Like light blooms were so overused; it was everywhere.
I mean, it was the colored lighting of its time.
Yeah.
The other, let's see, bloom, chromatic aberrations. That's people. It turns out
very polarizing.
Well, chromatic aberrations are one of the things that make people motion sick. More than anything else. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. We had some early on, we had some chromatic aberrations on some VFX in our game, and we had to pull them because it was making people feel real bad.
Wild. I wouldn't even associate that with motion because it's like a color separation thing. It's mimicking a lensing effect, right? Like it's something, if you have glasses of a certain or of a high enough prescription, you'll see it.
When you look off axis through them, you get red and blue depending on which side of the lens you're looking out.
You see the colors separating out a little bit. That's what that is. Some people just hate the way it looks also, I find.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to think. I think Control used a lot of chromatic aberrations. Oh, hold on, I was going to put something in there. The color balance. So there's also post-processing effects that are like almost like film production stuff where you can change the tone mapping, you can change the color balance of a scene. So you can make it go black and white, you can make it be full color, you can only have certain colors be visible, stuff like that. Vignetting, which is just kind of putting a frame around the edge of the screen like you would if you were on a too narrow a lens for your sensor size on your camera. TAA, temporal anti-aliasing, which is does anti-aliasing between frames, basically. FXAA, which is fast approximate. This is another one where the X is the letter in the acronym is in the middle of the word, which makes me crazy. Smooths edges. Often that's used for things like fences and narrow, skinny stuff.
I never knew what the X stood for in that. I'm glad I know now, even though it's an illegal abbreviation.
Yeah, there's crimes here. And then super sampling, which we talked about before, and film grain, which everybody should turn off immediately. I think motion blur fits in this category too, but I'm not 100% about that. It wasn't on the list here.
Yeah.
I'm realizing that now.
Look, man, film grain has its place. It can absolutely be overused.
It has its place in film, but when you're watching a digital medium that's recorded digitally and rendered digitally,
look, it's
film grain is what was the bad word from the early days of the iPhone? When you made your movie collection look like a shelf.
Oh, skeuomorphic.
Skeuomorphic.
Yeah.
It's the most skeuomorphic.
I guess. Look, it's an aesthetic choice. Okay, art direction.
I guess,
et cetera.
Whatever.
I liked it in Mass Effect. It looked good with those 70s lens flares.
I turned it off immediately. Give me the lens flare, though. I love a lens flare. Lens flare is also a post processing thing. So a lot of this stuff is low impact, like film grain, depth of field, tone mapping, color balance, all that stuff. A lot of these things you don't get access to. Chromatic aberrations, people let you turn off because some people hate them and some people make barf when you use them. Bloom, often you can turn off. None of this stuff is super high impact except for SSAO and the anti-aliasing stuff. And all of those are basically supplanted by the ray tracing and or DLSS, the ML super sampling stuff.
Yeah.
HDR is another weird one. I realized we forgot to put this on the main list.
I kind of wish we had left it off. HDR is a mess in PC games. It's really all over the place. Like everybody implements it differently. Some people don't support it right.
That's kind of what I wanted to say. It's like I often just turn it off.
Some give you too many options. It's in the note stock if people want to look it up. Cyberpunk literally, well, I can't see all the options right now, but Cyberpunk literally offers like 2 different HDR modes that use like terminology like sRGB something, and then I forget the other. You know what I mean? It's like unless
they let you pick the spec that you use, right?
Like unless you are a professional working in like color timing or something, you're gonna have no idea what those things mean. And I couldn't tell the difference between.
Speaking of color timing, that is another thing. If you actually take the time to calibrate your monitor and you let games use exclusive full screen, they won't use the color timing, the color calibration profiles that you set up because that runs through Windows. So worth knowing if you've bothered to color calibrate your monitors. I usually, what I'm going to say is don't use the auto HDR setting that's in Windows because it blows.
Does it?
I think it stinks.
Some people, I've not spent a lot of time with it personally, but some people seem to think it works pretty well.
I mean, I have had almost exclusively bad experiences with it. On games that do support HDR and you take the time to do the calibration, like don't skip the calibration steps if you're doing HDR. Don't cheese the calibration steps where because look, we've all done that thing where it's like, hey, adjust the gamma until you can barely see this darkest bit of the scene, right? And then we're like, you know what? It's pretty cool when you're playing a multiplayer game to be able to see people hiding in the shadows.
Yeah.
You can't do that with HDR because your stuff gets really washed out and janky and looks terrible.
That's just going to make everything look blown out.
A lot of games will actually ask you the max brightness of your monitor, which is a kind of insane thing to ask.
Yeah. I've noticed that trend of like, they literally like ask you how many nits can your display do or something. Like most people are not going to know that.
Well, I mean, you're going to want to go look up your monitor on the internet to see what it does.
Yeah.
Because if you get that wrong, it'll make things look real bad too. Like this is why it's messy. It's because as far as I can tell, there's no good way for the monitor to say to Windows, hey, here's what I support. And Windows doesn't care enough to report that back to games. So it's up to us as players to know this stuff on a game by game basis, which is janky and bad.
Another thing I should mention, I think I've got this right. Again, this stuff is pretty hard to figure out. I think you have to have HDR enabled in Windows at the desktop level before you then go into a game and turn it on there, right?
Yeah, it has to be on your monitor. It has to be on Windows. And it has to be on in the game.
Right. Like you can't leave HDR off at like, say, the Windows desktop and then just make a game force it on. It already has to be on in Windows. And a lot of people don't like the way that the desktop looks with HDR on, me included.
Especially if you have like 2 non-HDR monitors and 1 HDR monitor. There is a Windows shortcut for HDR to enable HDR. It's Windows key plus Alt plus B turns on HDR and turns
Windows
it off.
Alt B.
Windows Alt B. Really, that one, if you're going to use HDR on your Windows PC, that one's a banger.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I will keep that in mind. So that's pretty close to the reset the graphics driver entirely keyboard shortcut.
What is that? Control Alt B? Is B for graphics? I guess
it's Windows Control Shift B for that one, which completely restarts the graphics driver if you're having display issues. It's also a good one to know. Last thing I should mention here, I think we talked about this a few months ago in some other context. Maybe it was when I bought my TV or something.
Yeah, we talked about HDR.
Windows 11 has an HDR calibration tool now.
Oh, really?
You do have to go to the Microsoft store and download it. It doesn't just, it's not built into Windows 11 for whatever reason. Literally just called Windows HDR calibration. Just go to the Microsoft store and search for that. It's actually basically identical to the Xbox, like the Series X HDR calibration. So Series X and PS5 pretty much have this solved. I mean, of course they do because they're consoles.
Yeah.
It's a fixed platform, but it mimics that where it's literally just 3 quick screens of like, adjust the brightness so you can barely see this symbol. Now adjust it the other direction. Same thing. Like it takes 2 minutes.
That's really good.
So definitely do that in Windows 11 if you're going to try using HDR in games.
I wonder if it passes it forward to games or if that just sets the baseline for the monitor.
So Alan Wake 2 recommends that you do this.
Okay.
So I think it is working with games in some direct way.
Good to know. Hey, so the good news is we've done all the complicated stuff and all we have left is ray tracing.
Oh, yeah. It's just a fire and forget, right?
Yeah, ray tracing is really complicated, it turns out.
Yeah.
It's
well, for now, I guess like theoretically, eventually it's just going to be the thing and it's going to be
I mean, at some point in the future, yeah, but like right now, the way people are implementing it in games, it seems like it's like everybody picks and chooses the stuff that they want to apply ray tracing to.
Yes,
they're pretty tactical about it. With the exception of like Cyberpunk, where everything's traced to hell. You have to play it game by game. Basically, is the upshot here. There's no common rules. The hardware vendors are doing typically a pretty good job of highlighting the work for flagship games.
Yeah,
like I found a great blog post about Control on NVIDIA's blog, where they highlighted the 5 things that Control used ray tracing for, which is like floor, like reflections, environment reflections, like furniture reflecting onto the shiny concrete floors, white walls reflecting lights differently, stuff like that. Transparent reflections where you can see your character in glass windows, or if like there's a fight happening in a room with a bunch of glass, the particles are reflected in the windows, which normally doesn't happen on glass reflections when they're done by cube maps or other pre-computed volumes. Indirect diffuse lighting, which is where the color light bounces to nearby surfaces. So you get more than one bounce on the light maps, including dynamic. So typically with a light map, you only see lights on non-dynamic objects. So like if there's an enemy in a shadowy hallway, the light won't necessarily like the light won't reflect onto them. And in this case, it would.
Right. Like in that case, like the game developer in the rasterized situation is just using a different lighting technique to simulate that the light from the light map is hitting the dynamic object, even though it's a different technique under the
hood. They're saying, hey, you're standing inside a light map, therefore we should reduce your lighting by this much.
Right.
But also it means that like a projectile's light won't necessarily impact on anyway. Yeah.
So that's why, like, if you've watched like me flip out a Quake 2 RTX on a stream a couple of years ago or whatever, and specifically like, oh my God, all the power-ups are affected by the same lighting as everything else, stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's why, like, that's where having a fully generalized unified lighting model makes everything look really consistent and cool.
And the thing to know is that you're not replacing, like the ray trace stuff isn't replacing nothing. It's replacing hacks that were less good, right? It's things that we did to make things look okay, but and it's kind of like, I use this example a lot, but it's kind of like video compression, right? Where after you watch MPEG 2 video for a long time, you don't see the blockiness of it anymore. After you watch H.264 compression for long enough, you don't notice the kind of glitches around the edges of things anymore. And this is all stuff that as people who've been playing games for a long time, you probably don't even notice anymore until it's not there and it's working the way it does in the real world.
Right.
Contact shadows was another good one. So if you think about how shadows on a thing like a chain link fence or like a thin metal rod or really fences are the classic example because there's a lot of vertical things aligned with each other and they often get stair stepped out of existence because the light maps are lower resolution than the world and the shadows don't look good as a result. These give fine detail shadows that without having to do the kind of fine tuning. Like basically you put a higher resolution. The way to fix this is to put higher resolution light maps in areas where these types of things are, but that is incredibly time intensive and requires an artist going back over the levels again and again and again as things change. So this it kind of happens automatically and it looks really nice. It also means that like things are shadowed, like the inside of pipes and stuff like that are shadowed in a way that's appropriate, even when lighting in the world is changing. And then the last one is debris. So there's a couple of scenes in Control where like monsters come in and just destroy the whole world around you. And what they're doing is essentially letting the things that are typically visual effects and particles that maybe don't look like particles cast shadows and reflect light and do things. And it looks bonkers when you see it in person.
Yeah.
But the upshot on that is that the settings for Control and the settings for Alan Wake and the settings for Cyberpunk and the settings for Fortnite are all wildly different because their implementations of ray tracing are very highly specific to their games.
Yeah. And limited in some cases, like you said, they kind of pick and choose which parts of the render pipeline are handled by ray tracing and which are traditional. Like
Call of Duty has ray tracing, but they ray trace some shadows and I think a couple of there's like reflections occasionally, but not like world reflections. It's basically just you see the players in puddles and glass and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, the reason for that is that so far ray tracing has had an enormous performance cost. Like it's not what a lot of people would consider comfortably playable depending on the kind of hardware you're on. Like we're just getting to the point now where hardware is fast enough and also software is improving enough. Like that's why it was such a big deal, like marketing wise, like they made such a big push behind the Cyberpunk path tracing mode. Like path tracing in this context is a much more generalized, hey, now we're using ray tracing for everything in the game.
Yeah, so ray tracing traces out from the camera viewpoint to all the pixels in the scene, and path tracing is the other way. It bounces from light sources until it intersects with the camera, right?
I can't remember which direction. I think they're still going from surface back. I think they're still working backwards, but we're definitely not experts on that. I think it's tracing rays back from surface to camera instead of the other way around.
Right, but the rays, yeah.
But,
anyway,
but the upshot is there are way better algorithms coming out for like raycasting and resampling and all that stuff. Like if you've seen some of the, and I know this is a very NVIDIA heavy episode. I mean, they've been pushing ray tracing the hardest. RTX DI, I believe, is the name of their package that they put out along with Cyberpunk. That is incorporating a lot faster types of ray tracing processing. So I think we're going to start seeing more games that use ray tracing in a much more general global way.
Well, I think the other thing that's going to happen is we're going to start seeing current gen console exclusives that utilize the ray tracing stuff more.
Yeah, we're actually like Spider-Man 2 was a surprising example of that, where there is no mode on the PS, even on the PS5, there is no mode that doesn't use ray tracing to some degree. And that carries over to console ports, of course.
So path tracing, according to Digital Trends, ray tracing is more accurate. Path tracing is faster, can have some problems, but you can kind of work around the problems by applying some other clever solutions to them. Yeah. And that's why like Quake 2 RTX, that's why the games that have done full lighting model replacements have done path tracing for the most part. Let's see, last thing, I guess here, I'm trying to think. Motion blur. We didn't talk about motion blur, Brad.
No,
people love motion blur.
Do they?
Well, do you remember a couple of years ago when Digital Foundry did the thing that was like, hey, you know what? Forza Horizon looks as good at 30 frames a second with motion blur on as it does at 60 frames a second.
Mm-hmm.
People reacted pretty negatively to that, as I understand.
Yes, that is unsurprising.
Yeah. I tried it. Did you try it? Did you turn it on? I
did not.
I was really shocked.
At how effective it was?
I couldn't really tell the difference.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, let's see. Last couple of things. The latency reduction stuff like reflex and anti-lag on the AMD side are both really good. And if you have those supported in your games, it's worth turning them on, especially if you're using mouse and keyboard, because they do reduce the input to pixel latency quite a bit.
Yeah. I was going to ask earlier, is there any reason not to ever enable those? Nope. Is it just like if you run into problems, turn them off maybe?
The boost setting can increase your power consumption on NVIDIA side for the reflex plus boost, because it basically says, hey, don't make the GPU run it. Like keep this at the TDP if you have to hit the frame rate goals. My general advice is like turn off the frame generation for most stuff probably at this point, unless it's like heavy ray tracing type content.
Yeah. Again, Cyberpunk there was the example where like even a 4090 could only run Cyberpunk on the path tracing mode at 4K at like 30, basically about 30 FPS native.
You can see in my Alan Wake settings, I have DLSS I am using DLAA for the render resolution at my native 1080p, and I have frame generation on there. And that was nice. It performed well.
Yeah, Alan Wake is another one of the few games that's very heavy on ray tracing. But again, I think we're going to see a lot more of it in the next 2-3 years.
Well, and also like both of those, I mean, Cyberpunk a little bit less so, but Alan Wake is a game where like your input latency doesn't really matter, right? It's not like there's fast shooting sequences or you're basically walking around being a kind of grumpy old guy and doing cop stuff. So yeah, that's it. That's settings. Do we miss anything else important?
I don't think so. I mean, us miss something? Absolutely
That's
not.
shocking. Yeah. But please let us know if you thought this was useful or helpful. The other one is Unreal 5 stuff. Unreal 5 has a completely different pipeline for ray tracing than anybody else. So as we start to see Unreal 5 games, they will probably be a little bit more in common if they're using Nanite and Lumen and all that stuff.
Right.
But it's a kind of hybrid CPU GPU solution that's I'm going to say it's not super well documented from a what this means for people standpoint. If you're playing, say, Fortnite, which is a competitive game, probably I turn all that stuff off. If you're playing something that is not competitive and you want to look nice, turn it all on. Get crazy.
Going right back to the days of Quake 1 when I had the 3FX card and thought it was cool, and then I went back to the software mode because I got 200 frames a second.
The guy who ran the Linux lab that I've talked about, I think in the past, had settings for Quake 1 with 3D acceleration that basically turned the MIP levels all the way down.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's a classic.
So it was like,
yes.
like the health box was just like a brown box with a red circle on it, basically a fuzzy red circle.
Yep. That's the classic for competitive.
Good times. I don't think it really mattered all that much, Brad.
Probably not.
No, but yeah, let us know. Let us know if there's other settings. If there's other settings you don't understand, you'd like to know more about. We will track them down, post it, send us an email at techpod at content.town or in the question seeking answers channel in the Discord, and we will drill down and figure it out. And if we don't know the answer, we'll call NVIDIA and AMD and ask them to please help us answer your questions. But I think that's it for us this week, Brad.
Yeah.
As always, Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod is a 100% listener supported show. Without you all, we wouldn't be here. So thank you to all of our patrons for supporting the show.
Yes, thank you.
If you would like to find out how to support Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod, you can go to patreon.com/techpod. Again, you can go to patreon.com/techpod. And for $5 a month, you get access to the fabulous TechPod Discord, our monthly patron exclusive episodes. And you get to know that like we get to continue making a podcast. So that's really good too.
Yes, that helps. That's cool.
Yeah, I like right now in between, I'm going to go and tell you, having a little bit of income while I'm in between and kind of talking to people about jobs. It's comforting to know that this is there. It helps a lot. So we really appreciate it.
I've also had that thought about this podcast. Thank you to everyone who keeps it going. Also, you get to be on the Discord and, for example, when you're trying to continuity test an HDMI cable and want to get some advice about a better way to do that, that's a good place to ask questions like that.
Oh, it seems like you're ripped from the headlines kind of example there, Brad.
Yeah. So, there's guaranteed if it's technical in nature, somebody's going to have some idea about it there.
I've enjoyed the conversations about the last patron episode where we talked about vertical monitors, and everybody's been sharing pictures of their vertical monitors, their ultra wide vertical monitors.
Oh no, I hadn't seen that. I have to see that.
And we also got into the B-Links, B-Link versus how to wake on LAN a B-Link and how to do a remote start on a B-Link, which I've been curious about because it's a situation of concern to me.
Does that thing have an accessible BIOS or UEFI?
It's a little thin, Brad.
UEFI.
It's a bad.
Who the hell thought BIOS?
UFI.
BIOS. Listen to that. Just listen to it.
BIOS? UFI.
BIOS.
UFI.
UFI?
UFI.
UEFI. I can't even say it 3 times.
UFI.
UFI?
UFI.
WEFI?
Say UFI.
BIOS. I'm just going to keep saying BIOS.
Anyway, it's patreon.com/techpod. We really appreciate the support. And we especially appreciate our executive producer tier patrons, including Paddle Creek Games, makers of Fractured Veil, Andrew Slosky, Jordan Lippett, Bunny Fiend, The, Just Wedge, Joel Krauska, Twinkle Twinkie, David Allen, James Kamek, and Pantheon, makers of the HS3 high-speed 3D printer. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you.
Yes, we do.
And with that, we will be back next week with another edition of the Tech Pod. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We hope you have a productive and lovely week. Bye.